Gerard, let me start with you. Please tell us why you and none of your colleagues here would make the very best leader of the Liberal Party.
Well, I'm going to let my colleagues speak for themselves. I think that really I'm here because I believe I can be a leader, a catalyst for the Liberal Party. We need a new kind of politics to get the solutions that are really going to matter. And we're not going to be the party of complaint, I don't think, about Harris. There are huge problems there. The province is being divided up. But there's another agenda being missed entirely, and that is to do with how this new economy, globalization, technology can be made to work in a way that's fair to people. And I think that's where the Liberal Party has to go. We've been there in terms of progress before, trying to interpret it for people, and that's what I want to do as the leader of the Liberal Party.
Perfect. Dalton, why would you make the best leader?
Well, I have 6 years parliamentary experience, and oddly enough, at this stage, that makes me one of the more experienced people seeking the leadership. But there's more than that. I think my vision is more suited to both the party and the times. I am extremely optimistic about the future of our party and our province. And I know that people today, I've had the opportunity to travel the province now, and the prevailing sentiment is one of extreme insecurity. So as a general rule, I don't talk about what we can't do, I talk about what we can do, and I don't talk about where we are, I talk about where it is that all of us together might go, and that's a very important point. We're leaving too many people behind under the Harris agenda, and I think there are different ways to do it so we can all move forward together.
Thank you. Dwight, you know the question.
We need a new Liberal Party with a new leader and a new vision for the new century. We need a leader who can rebuild our party from the ground up. I've had 25 years in our party at all levels, ranging from being an MPP right down to being a poll captain. We need a leader with a broad range of experiences. I've spent a good deal of my life in municipal politics, running the largest alcohol and drug recovery facility in Canada. We need a leader who can communicate well in both official languages. And we need a party with a vision and a party that stands for something. And I think we can do that. And I frankly think any one of these candidates will be a better premier than Mike Harris. And I'll be proud to stand with all of them.
Okay, Premier Mike Harris, let's start there. He continues to be very popular in the polls, as does his government. Can you tell us how you would be different, specifically with respect to the economy? What would you do about jobs? What would you do about money?
Well, first of all, we in the Liberal Party know what it's like to be very popular before an election, and we know how quickly that can change. We all agree, I think, that we have to balance the budget. I think the question is where we go, how fast we go there, and what our priorities are. And our priorities are very different from Mr. Harris's.
Give me an example.
Education. I would not cut education funding. I would reinvest. I would demand greater levels of accountability. Healthcare.
But right now you're talking about spending, and I'm talking about the economy. How do you get it going now?
You have to have an element of growth. You have to have an element of fiscal responsibility, and you have to have a desire to set your priorities. And there will be tough choices for a Liberal government.
But there's another part of that, though. Excuse me, Dalton. But the job starts on Monday. The tax cut hasn't been implemented yet. And as far as I'm concerned, if there's going to be a fiscal future that doesn't put us all in some kind of straitjacket, it's about delaying the tax cut. It is simply not appropriate for this province at this time. The fiscal drag numbers that are being produced are saying that it's having a negative unintended effect on the economy. It can't really be sustained. I think that's where the Liberal Party has to go.
But surely you're not saying that you are going to have any influence whatsoever, regardless of what happens at Maple Leaf Gardens or what Premier Harris does.
If we know how untenable this is, I think that we have to make sure that at least this government looks at that option. There are many voices out there starting to agree. And I was in a by-election not long ago where there were a lot of sorry Tories that voted Liberal this time because they didn't believe the tax cut was viable in terms of the services it was taking away and so on. And so part of that, I think, has to be clear, that the Liberal Party will be out there fighting this tax cut, trying to make sure that this government does a more responsible agenda in the lead up to the next election.
The other thing that we're missing right now is that we don't have a comprehensive economic strategy. Certainly one part of an economic strategy would consist of finding new efficiencies in government. But I don't think Mike Harris is even getting that part of it right. But in addition to that, you've got to look to the future and ask yourself, what is it that we can do in our province better than anybody else on the planet? And how is it we ought to be nurturing those kinds of industries or those particular kinds of sectors? And frequently, it comes back to education. I'll give you an example, Paula. In my community, in Ottawa, we have 3,000 high-tech jobs we can't fill because we haven't got qualified people to fill them. That's a simple example of some role that government might play in marrying the needs of the workplace with what's going on in our schools.
So you're talking about high school students or adult retraining what?
Both. Everything. It's got to start from junior kindergarten. I think it was a terrible mistake to cut JK. All of the studies show, all of the experts will tell us that every child from all socioeconomic groups stands to benefit.
Okay, but gentlemen, what will you do right now for the number of people who are unemployed? We're not talking about going back for retraining for 1 year or 2 or finishing high school. What are you going to do about today?
Well, I think you ask a very important question in terms of the short term. First of all, we, as a government, you do have to get the fiscal house in order. The NDP left a horrendous mess, and it has to be cleaned up. That's one element to successful job creation. Second element is to accept that government does have a role, I think, in creating not only an environment but in creating jobs. Another candidate mentioned trade offices. That's one possibility. Another thing they've done is they've gotten right out of venture capital for small business by canceling the ODC. These are penny-wise, pound-foolish decisions that, in my view, are going to create much larger deficits down the road. And my biggest concern as a potential leader of this party is the mess we're going to have to clean up in 1999 with deficits in education, deficits in healthcare, and frankly, because of the way they've done the tax cut, I'm not sure, and I think the Dominion Bond Rating Service is saying they're going to have a tough time balancing the budget.
I want to go back to the tax cut, but let me just ask you a question. Government growing jobs. Does that mean, for example, that you'd put 12,000, 14,000 civil servants who are losing their jobs under this government back to work?
I think, but that's going to depend.
Dalton said no. How come?
No, we can't. We have an obligation to find efficiencies within government. And that is a demand that's being made throughout the province. What we can do, however, is look to the future. And there's no quick fix for short-term jobs. Government, at the end of the day, does not create jobs. What it can do is, through a partnership role with the business community and our educational institutions, help develop the conditions which help nurture job creation by the private sector.
But I think people expect even more than that. I mean, we have to look at things like the work week. We have to look at how we can make it more favorable a business climate to have full-time jobs rather than part-time ones. That insecurity that people are feeling is an economic factor, and there has to be at least a facilitating role by the government working with business, because there are businesses out there starting to be concerned. Who's buying the cars? What kind of market are we going to be able to have? And what kind of growth are we going to be able to sustain? So those things have to be deliberate choices made by government.
I think, Gerard, if you say to the business community in Ontario that you're looking at changing hours of work. I participated in the Donner Task Force 10 years ago. You could not arrive at consensus on that.
No,
it's a very difficult thing,
but
it's a very difficult thing to impose those kinds of views in an economy where capital moves freely, and we have to be cognizant of that.
But we're not going for an international minimum wage, Dwight. And this province has a jurisdiction that is desirable for business, and this is already a discussion the business community is having.
We have to be careful that we don't take... No, let me finish. I wanted to respond to what you said.
The head of the Business Council on National Issues, which has not been the biggest friend of the Liberal Party, but last year said the #1 priority for business for the next 10 years is going to be things like jobs and poverty. Now, if the business community is talking about, why are politicians afraid to say that in this jurisdiction in Ontario, we want to have the good jobs, we want to have the infrastructure in place, and we want the type of business, and we can work in the reward and recognition structure.
Let me help you for just a moment, Dwight. Absolutely, but let's be clear here. Gerard is saying that he'd like to see what, for example, perhaps some overtime outlawed, the work week shortened, work sharing?
We're looking at what kind of package of regulations, of incentives can we create to change what's happening right now. Are there anything about those trends that we can have some influence on? There's a lot of inconvenience in terms of setting up jobs. It's very convenient to keep people working overtime. What kind of things can we do in terms of payroll taxes, in terms of other things to facilitate that?
I think what's wrong with that?
Well, there's nothing wrong with looking at it, but if you're going to talk about hours of work, if you had participated, the opportunity to participate in the hearings on Bill 49, for instance, the business community gets very nervous when you look at the Employment Standards Act. We have to look at the Employment Standards Act. We have to be creative in terms of creating an investment climate, but you have to be very careful that you don't take positions or advocate positions that will force capital to move out.
These are discussions I've already had with business people, and they're not afraid of
things that you can do.
Dalton, let's hear from you.
Okay. I'm in the middle, and I'm going to marry these two interests here. There are certain kinds of things that you can do to promote and encourage corporate social responsibility. And you can do that through positive reinforcement. It doesn't have to be a matter of hitting business over the head. And there are certain kinds of tax initiatives, benefits that could be advanced. For instance, if a corporation keeps its overtime down, if a corporation invests in its employees through retraining, if a corporation gives its employees maybe a share of the growth. Those kinds of things are the things that we ought to be considering right now. And in fact, the public has a role to play in this. We happen to invest in companies. We have successfully greened a number of corporations now because we have selectively decided where we're going to invest. And if they're not being friendly towards the environment, we're not going to invest there. And we can do the same kind of thing with respect to corporate social responsibility.
Okay, gentlemen, let's just shift a little bit. Go back to something we were touching upon, the tax cut. It was incredibly effective in helping this government get itself elected. People still seem to like the idea of it. Would you increase taxes?
No.
Tell us why not.
Can't do it. It won't help the economy. The government, by the way, I don't agree with your analysis that the tax cut helped get the government elected. I think most people in the last election, for a whole variety of reasons, they voted for the government. I think the tax cut was probably a part of that. But we did learn in York South that once you start discussing that issue, tax cut's not the foremost in people's mind. What's foremost in people's mind is that government manages its affairs responsibly and that it spends prudently. And I think the other thing that distinguishes us as a party from the Conservatives is we do believe there's a role for government. We believe it has to be better managed, it has to be more properly directed. But I don't agree with your
So is there
thesis.
going to be a difficult situation then? Let's imagine the Liberal Party got elected next time around. You're not going to increase taxes, but you have all talked about more spending for education, for health care. Where is the money going to come from?
Well, according to Mr. Harris, all the health care dollars will be back in the budget anyways.
And
but what's going to happen is you raise a very fundamental question. Yes, there's going to be a mess clean up. There's a mess in education, a mess in healthcare, and there's going to be depleted provincial revenues. I mean, somewhere around $10 to $12 billion on an annualized basis. And yes, we are going to have to make tough choices. But
so
I think
balancing the books, is that important to you? Is getting the deficit down important?
Yes, it is. The question isn't whether or not you do it or what direction you go in. It's how you get there and over what period of time.
It's taken us quite an amount of time now to get into this financial mess, and we ought to take our time to get out of it. Reckless cutting is just as dangerous as reckless spending. Both lead to long-term problems, and Mike Harris simply does not understand that.
So let's hold on, Gerard, before we go on, let's be clear on what Dalton's saying. So you would not hike taxes.
I would definitely not hike taxes.
You would work to get that deficit down.
Yes.
What would your new target date be?
That's something I'd want to sit down and work out. But
so you're not going to say year 2000,
no,
2001?
No, I don't have that luxury to be able to state that. And I think people see through that kind of thing today. We have to put in place, develop a goal that's manageable and that is not costly in terms of the kinds of services that are reduced, which benefit people throughout the process.
Gerard, would taxes go up?
Taxes, the unfortunate thing today is that even though taxes haven't yet gone down, they're likely to, we're not going to be in a position to increase them. That gives us a 12% loss in revenue. It gives us all kinds of problems. But I think what people want to see from the Liberal Party anyway is some innovation. They want to know that the timetable and the way that we can work with government services is going to be one that, yes, the deficit is important, but just one of the reference points. We also have to have targets in terms of education, in terms of health care, and in terms of opportunity that have to be done. Now, that's the kind of reference. If we haven't been successful by the time of the next election in making those things resonate for people out there, I don't think our chances for being elected are very good, or if they are, they'll be on an agenda that isn't like the Liberal Party.
Okay, on that note,
well, if I can just, I want to add one brief point. One of the big mistakes we made last year is the Tories said we'll balance the budget in 5 years, and we said, well, we'll do it in 4 years, as if there's some magic. You know, the federal Canadian government, the governments in New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, set targets in-year basis and meet them. That satisfies the bond markets and leaves public policymakers the flexibility to deal with things like education.
Okay, on that note,
right now,
gentlemen, we have to share a little bit of the time.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.